Imagine standing on the edge of the known world, looking out into an endless, terrifying void of ocean. In the year 1492, the Atlantic was not a highway. It was a graveyard of dark myths, a vast expanse where people genuinely believed the water boiled at the equator, sea monsters swallowed entire fleets, and a ship could plunge straight off the edge of the earth. To sail out into that darkness was considered absolute madness. Yet, one man looked at that terrifying horizon and saw a path to ultimate glory. He was not a king, a general, or a prince. He was a self-taught weaver's son possessed by a vision so intense it bordered on insanity. He defied the greatest minds of his era, lied to his own crew to keep them from mutiny, and risked everything on a calculation that was completely wrong. This is the story of Christopher Columbus, a man driven by obsession, shrouded in mystery whose desperate gamble inadvertently tore the curtain of the known world wide open and changed the destiny of human civilization forever. To understand the sheer scale of this mystery, we have to look at the world as it was in the late 15th century. Europe was locked in a cage. For decades, the Silk Road and the overland trade routes to the wealthy empires of Asia had been choked off by the fall of Constantinople. Spice, silk, and gold were the lifeblood of European economies. But obtaining them now meant paying extortionate taxes to hostile empires or braving treacherous lands. The nation that could find a direct sea route to the Indies would become the undisputed superpower of the world. Portugal was already making massive strides, aggressively charting a path down the uncharted western coast of Africa, hoping to round the continent. But Christopher Columbus had a radically different, almost suicidal idea. Why sail all the way around Africa when you could simply sail straight west across the Atlantic Ocean? Contrary to popular myth, the educated elite of the 15th century did not believe the Earth was flat. Mathematicians and astronomers had known it was a sphere since the time of ancient Greece. The real debate wasn't about the shape of the Earth, but its size, and this is where the mystery of Columbus deepens. He was an incredibly skilled navigator, yet his calculations for the journey were catastrophically incorrect. He had stitched together a collection of flawed geographical theories, biblical prophecies, and wishful thinking. He concluded that Asia was thousands of miles closer to Europe than it actually was, believing the Atlantic Ocean was a narrow, easily manageable strip of water. Had he known that an enormous, twice as large ocean and two massive, undiscovered continents lay in his path, he likely would have never left port. He was chasing a ghost, a geographical illusion born of his own stubborn conviction. For nearly a decade, Columbus took his radical proposal to the royal courts of Europe, begging for funding. He went to Portugal, then England, then France, and finally Spain. Everywhere he went, the royal committees of scientists and geographers laughed him out of the room. They told him his math was completely wrong, that the distance was too vast, and that any crew foolish enough to try would inevitably starve to death in the middle of a barren ocean. He became a wandering beggar in the courts, a tragic figure ridiculed by scholars and dismissed by kings. Years bled into one another, and Columbus grew desperate, his hair turning prematurely white from stress and poverty. But just as he was about to pack his bags and abandon Spain forever, a miraculous shift occurred. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain finally conquered the Kingdom of Granada, ending centuries of religious warfare. Flush with victory, and desperate to outmaneuver their rivals in Portugal, the Spanish monarchs decided to take the ultimate gamble. They granted Columbus his ships, his titles, and his chance at destiny. On August 3, 1492, 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, unfurled their sails and slipped out of the port of Palos, Spain. A crew of around 90 men looked back at the receding coastline, many wondering if they would ever see dry land again. As the weeks rolled by, the psychological terror of the open ocean began to take a heavy toll. They sailed past the Canary Islands and plunged deeper into the unknown than any Europeans had ever gone before. The winds blew them steadily westward, which comforted them at first, but soon sparked a terrifying realization. If the wind always blew west, how would they ever manage to sail back home? The ocean became an endless, repeating loop of blue and gray. To prevent a full-scale panic, Columbus began keeping two separate logbooks. In the official book, which he showed to the crew, he deliberately downplayed the distance they had traveled, making the journey seem shorter and closer to safety. In his private log, he recorded the true, terrifying distance. But you can only hide the truth for so long. By early October, they had been at sea for over a month, without a single glimpse of land. The water supplies were turning foul, the food was rotting, and the psychological weight of the endless horizon was crushing the crew. Whispers of mutiny turned into open defiance. The men openly plotted to throw Columbus overboard and turn the ships back toward Spain before they all starved. Sensing the imminent danger, Columbus made a desperate pact with his captains and crew. He begged them for just 3 more days. If they did not strike land within 72 hours, he promised they would turn around. It was a massive bluff. 2 days passed in agonizing silence. The tension on the ships was suffocating. Then nature began to drop subtle clues. Branches with green leaves floated past the holes. Flocks of land birds were spotted flying toward the southwest. The air felt different, carrying the faint, earthy scent of soil instead of the sterile tang of the deep ocean. No one slept on the night of October 11th. Everyone stood at the railings, straining their eyes into the pitch-black darkness, praying for a miracle. At 2 o'clock in the morning, on October 12, 1492, a sudden flash of moonlight illuminated a distant white sand cliff. A lookout aboard the Pinta, named Rodrigo de Triana, screamed out the words that would echo through the centuries. "Tierra! Tierra! Land! Land!" When the sun rose, it revealed a lush, tropical paradise rising from the turquoise waters. Columbus, wearing his finest armor and carrying the royal banner of Spain, stepped into a small boat and rowed ashore. As his boots sank into the warm sand of the island he named San Salvador, he fell to his knees, wept with gratitude, and claimed the land for the Spanish crown. He was convinced, with absolute certainty, that he had done the impossible. He believed he was standing on an island just off the coast of Japan or India. He had no idea that he had actually stumbled upon the Bahamas, opening the gateway to an entirely new hemisphere. Soon, the curious inhabitants of the island, the Taino people, emerged from the dense foliage to greet these strange, bearded visitors who had arrived in floating castles. Columbus, still trapped in his geographical delusion, called them Indians. The initial meeting was peaceful, defined by curiosity and the exchange of simple gifts like glass beads and parrot feathers. But the atmosphere of wonder quickly turned sharp and cold. Columbus noticed small, gleaming pieces of gold hanging from the noses and ears of the natives. In that exact moment, the peaceful expedition transformed into an aggressive hunt. The obsession with finding the Great Khan of China was instantly replaced by a frantic search for the source of that gold. Columbus spent the next few months sailing from island to island, exploring Cuba and Hispaniola, his eyes constantly searching for the grand palaces of Asia, but finding only tropical villages. Disaster struck on Christmas Eve when the Santa Maria ran aground on a coral reef and was completely wrecked. Armed with the wood from the shattered ship, Columbus built a crude fortress, left 39 of his men behind, and set sail back to Europe aboard the remaining 2 ships, eager to announce his triumph to the world. When Columbus returned to Spain, he was received with the honors of a conquering hero. He rode through the streets flanked by colorful parrots, exotic plants, and captive indigenous people, while the crowds cheered his name. The monarchs rewarded him with immense wealth, noble titles, and the governorship of the new lands. He was at the absolute pinnacle of his life. But this moment of triumph marked the beginning of a dark, tragic downward spiral. Columbus would return to the Caribbean 3 more times, but each subsequent voyage dragged him deeper into chaos, brutality, and madness. When he returned to his fortress on the second voyage, he found that his men had abused the local population, who had retaliated by wiping the Spanish garrison out completely. The peaceful coexistence was shattered forever. Desperate to justify the immense cost of his expeditions to the king and queen, Columbus turned to tyranny. He forced the indigenous populations into brutal slave labor, demanding strict quotas of gold. Those who failed to collect enough gold had their hands brutally severed as a warning to others. As a governor, Columbus was a disastrous failure. He was a brilliant navigator, but a terrible administrator, ruling his own colonists with an iron fist and executing anyone who opposed him. The colony dissolved into anarchy, rebellion, and horrific violence. Word of his tyranny eventually reached Spain, and in the year 1500, a royal investigator arrived in the Caribbean. Christopher Columbus, the Grand Admiral of the Ocean Sea, was arrested, placed in heavy iron chains, and shipped back to Spain in absolute disgrace. Though he was eventually stripped of his governorship, the king and queen allowed him one final desperate voyage in 1502. By this time, Columbus was physically broken, suffering from severe arthritis and slipping into religious mysticism. He spent his final years writing strange texts, convinced he was chosen by God to usher in the end of the world. He died in 1506 at the age of 54, wealthy but deeply bitter, isolated and largely forgotten by the royal court. To his very last breath, Christopher Columbus stubbornly believed that he had reached the eastern edge of Asia. He died completely blind to the reality of what he had actually accomplished. The mystery of Columbus is not just about the man himself, but the colossal, terrifying wave of history he unleashed. He did not discover America in a literal sense. Millions of people already lived there, and Norse explorers had touched the northern shores centuries earlier. But Columbus was the one who connected the two halves of the planet permanently. His voyage ignited the Columbian Exchange, a massive, unprecedented transfer of plants, animals, cultures, and ideas between the Old and New worlds. Potatoes and corn from the Americas fueled a population boom in Europe, while horses and cattle transformed the American landscape. But this connection came at a catastrophic cost. The microscopic diseases carried by the Europeans, to which the native populations had no immunity, swept through the Americas like a silent wildfire, wiping out up to 90% of the indigenous population in one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. The fall of these empires paved the way for centuries of ruthless colonization, exploitation, and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Christopher Columbus remains one of the most polarizing and mysterious figures to ever walk the earth. Was he a brilliant, visionary explorer who bravely united a fractured planet, or was he a ruthless, driven conqueror who brought unimaginable suffering to an innocent world? Perhaps he was both. He was a flawed, complex human being whose grand delusion accidentally broke the world apart and remade it in his own image. He set sail to find a shortcut to the past, and instead collided headfirst into the future, changing the destiny of the world forever. If this journey into the past has captivated you, don't forget to leave a like. It's the best way to support this project and keep history alive. To continue unraveling the mysteries of the most fascinating figures who ever walked this earth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss our next trip through time. Until next time.